Right. So the theme of this lecture is the rise of prose in the 18th century, especially in the Augustan age. And what I'll be discussing here can be divided into three different segments. One is I'll look at the reasons for the development of prose in the 18th century. Second, I'll look at the different varieties of prose that were in circulation during the 18th century. And thirdly, I'll look at the ramifications or the implications of the rise of prose during the 18th century. So this is three kinds of divisions within which I've broken up this discussion. Now let me start off with suggesting that prose as a form had developed later than poetry, but we have it right from the Old English period. The Middle English largely talked about prose in terms of religious allegory and in terms of romances across the continent. What is very noticeable during the 18th century is the rise of prose in the discourse of news. Right. Now, I would like to suggest that the primary reason for this, of course, would be the rise of empiricism as a philosophy. Now, what empiricism did, especially with Locke and Descartes, is it that it suggested that all knowledge was based on sense experience. And because all knowledge was based on sense experience, therefore, the question of recording that sense experience became fundamentally important. And this was not the sense experience of just a particular class of people. It was equally the sense experience spread across different classes. The second thing that we had noted was that literature till the 18th century was restricted to a certain minority part of the population, primarily because print culture was extremely expensive. Now, with the rise of Grub Street, the cheap printing press, the rise of Moorfields, and the availability of cheap print, the dissemination of print became rampant. This is a very important aspect. You see, because the common people could now have access to print. It's very important. As a result of which, we see the rise of a vibrant print industry and the rise of a reasonable reading public. Now, the reading public was again, fueled by the rise of literacy in England. And we'll see that the figures of literacy rose in men approximately 100%, 200%, and in women about 400%. So suddenly, there was a body of people who could read. And this body of people was not restricted to one particular class. It was dispersed across the classes. Secondly, with the rise of empiricism, as I pointed out, this group of people saw that knowledge was available within not the remote experience, but within the everyday, right? And that is what John Dunton, one of the pioneer, print capitalists of that period, who started a periodical called the Athenian Mercury, Dunton referred to this as the Athenian each. I'll talk about this tomorrow also, about Dunton in more details. But Dunton talks about news and contemporary experience, contemporaneity, as a phenomenon which took hold of the public imagination. So there are three factors that I'm bringing in. One is the presence of a philosophy that suggested that sense experience was the route to knowledge, and therefore contemporary sense experience could be applicable to contemporary knowledge and profit. One. Second, rise of literacy and a reading public. Therefore, the conditions were ripe for people to read this discourse of news. And third, the availability of a cheap print culture, to the rise of Grub Street and its ilk, which meant that the desire to consume news could be fulfilled through cheap means. Now, some of you might wonder, why would people read? Now, that's an interesting question, really, because, you see, along with print, what was rampantly rising was also capitalism and colonialism. And England became the center of this capitalist, colonialist enterprise. So that we've seen already the rise of the port cities and the megacity, metropolis of London, where people congregated from across the different parts of England. So massive movement from the country to the city. Now, therefore, rise in trade and commerce. And therefore, one who could read and write and consume the news could participate in this colonialist, capitalist narrative. And therefore, print became enormously useful. The other factor that we can take a look at is the lapse of the Licensing Act. 1695 it lapses, and therefore censorship goes for a toss. And there's a whole range of narratives that flood the market. Right? Now, what is the nature of this print is very important. The nature of this print is that, it is providing information rather than morality, one. And secondly, it is also providing pleasure rather than instruction. So we have a range of narratives now, which cater to pleasure and information apart from morality. This is not to say that religious narratives died out all of a sudden. They were there, but they were supplemented and overwhelmed by a prose of information, news, and a prose of pleasure. The other thing that we need to also talk about very briefly is that there was in literature, the news turned towards, as we saw, social improvement and reflection, right? So the nature of the prose was directed towards the public spaces, public behavior, public issues. And with the absence of censorship, what we now see is the rise of a public sphere where people participated in discussions about public welfare. Earlier, it was restricted to the court and the body of the king. Now it suddenly became dispersed, as earlier, to questions about, the penal code, for example, to questions about women, to questions about sexuality, morality, marriage, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we have, what I'll argue is, the rise of a very vibrant public sphere. Very often, the debates were between the Tories and the Whigs on politics, or between the Catholics and the Protestants on religion, or for that matter, on sexual scandals. But people participated within this public sphere in coffee houses, physically, and through this print space. And therefore, we have the rise of a prose that catered to this public sphere. The other thing that you should also remember is that London by this time was a sprawling metropolis. And it was generating not only aristocratic society, but it was also generating the presence of a tremendous underclass, which constituted of criminals, prostitutes, people who live hand to mouth, right? So these underclasses also demanded their share of representation within the spaces of prose. So while 18th century poetry primarily catered to the stylized elite aristocratic, 18th century prose, on the other hand, moved in a different direction and fulfilled the demand for news and pleasure of the different classes. So I am locating, therefore, to sum up this particular section, the reasons for the rise of prose in 6 different segments. Segment 1, the rise of empiricism, importance of sense experience as the gateway to knowledge. This is point number 1. Point number 2, rise of a reading public, and therefore the growth of prose to fulfill to the desire and the demand of this reading public. 3, the rise of a modern print culture, cheap print culture, which was able to supply these people with news. 4, the rise of a vibrant public sphere where public issues were discussed in prose. 5th, the rise of the metropolis and the cities, which meant that a lot of these people of the underclasses demanded pleasure and information, which 18th century prose supplied. And finally, I would say that there was this general which meant that a plethora of and a range of prose forms could freely circulate. So these were the reasons for which prose developed during the 18th century. Now let me come to this issue about what were these prose forms. Now I'm going to divide them into certain categories. And the first category would be the category of pure news. Now you will know that 1794 we have the Daily Courant, which was part and parcel of the first English newspaper. Initially in just one piece of paper, right, printed on both sides. But the Daily Courant published, news, shipping news, sensational news. So this was the discourse of news. Also fulfilling this was the form that we'll study in details, the periodical essay. Now, the periodical essay, almost every major 18th century writer participated in, be it Defoe, Addison, Steele, Fielding, Dr. Johnson, Goldsmith, whoever you name, he was part and parcel of a periodical newspaper, a periodical essay. Now, the periodical essay was different from the newspaper. The newspaper was dedicated to the daily news. The periodical essay, on the other hand, took up a certain social issue or a certain matter of discussion. For example, maybe the interaction between the squire and the clergy, or the presence of superstition, change of fashion, role of women, right? And dedicated an entire issue to that particular social or moral issue. So it was a kind of an advisory. It generated a debate on a particular point, but it was published, as you see, for example, with Addison's paper, Spectator, almost on a daily basis or thrice a week. Addison, for example, published it for 555 days. That was not a mean achievement at that point of time. What was the kind of circulation? Addison says he published 3,000 papers daily. And he says that every paper which was pasted on the coffee house would have 20 readers. So 3,000 into 20 would mean 60,000 people were reading the Spectator papers. A phenomenal number when you consider that there would probably be, 2 lakh, 3 lakh people who were literate in London. So almost the entire middle class was reading the Spectator papers of Addison. Now, these periodical essays could be political. For example, there was the Jacobite Journal, which Fielding edited. It could be directed towards particular segments. For example, the Lloyd's Coffee House and the journal that it produced talked about shipping news. So these became niche, periodical essays, politically inclined, but they satisfied or was part of this discourse of news itself. There were broadsheets and pamphlets, very often political in nature. Very often, these broadsheets were paid for. Hack writers were writing this. There were scandal sheets which reported scandals on various public personalities. For example, there were a lot of scandal sheets about Walpole, the Prime Minister. So this was the discourse of news. Also part of this were, very importantly, the publication of subjective diaries. The two men who popularized this, of course, was John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys. P-E-P-Y-S, not Pepys, but Pepys. Now, Pepys's diary, for example, has very authentic records of the Great Fire and the Plague of London. Right? Therefore, we have, through these diaries, a very minute record of contemporary events. So this is the discourse of news that I see as part of 18th century prose. Now, the second part is, of course, life writing and religion. There were a lot of people who were writing biographies and autobiographies. Of course, you will remember Boswell writing the life of Johnson. And you have numerous biographies and autobiographies being written. So people were writing about their daily experiences. Part of these writings were also spiritual autobiographies. So religion came into these biographies and autobiographies. What was the spiritual autobiography? The spiritual autobiography was a biography that recorded your daily experience, the sins committed, and tried to locate a kind of a religious pattern within the autobiographical experiences. Remember this very carefully, because the spiritual autobiography was going to be the model on which Robinson Crusoe is going to be based. So Robinson Crusoe's journal of his island existence is given a religious kind of a dimension and structure by Defoe. And therefore, Defoe was borrowing from this tradition of the spiritual autobiography. It was very often said metallectics, called by the name of metallectics, metellectists, metallectics, CS, I'm sorry, metallectics. So this was a religious autobiography where all your experience was analyzed in terms of religious patterns. There were, of course, religious tracts, sermons which were published. Religion did not vanish, by the way. It was a very strong presence. You had a text like a religious allegory like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, for example, which is also being published. So there was a very strong moral content also available in the prose literature of the 18th century. And this was aligned, in a certain sense, with the life writings of the period. So the first genre was the prose of news. The second was the prose of autobiographies and religion. The third I will consider is the prose of criminality. Now, why do I bring this into my discussion is that unlike the other ages, with the development of the city and its underworld, as it were, criminality became a rampant problem in 18th century England. So much so, that the controlling of criminals became an important social issue. Highwaymen were on the roads. You had pickpockets. You had different kinds of swindlers, scamsters. So, you had thieves. And as I said, the bloody code was in operation. So cartloads of people were taken to the Tyburn tree to be hanged. And these criminals very often were not reviled by the common people, because the common people saw that many of them were slipping into poverty. So you could become a common citizen today, and you could also slip into criminality the next day. Life was so uncertain. Therefore, these criminals were very often treated in terms of heroism and seen as, characters in narratives, heroic characters in narratives. Take the example of Jack Shepherd, for example. Jack Shepherd was this notorious thief who could break out of any jail. So he became a subject of numerous criminal biographies. The other name I should also mention, of course, one of the names you know already, Moll Flanders, women criminals. Moll King was this pickpocket and prostitute whom Defoe actually interviewed in Newgate prison. And he wrote Moll Flanders based on the experiences of Moll King. Also important was this character called Jonathan Wilde. Now, Jonathan Wilde was a strange individual in the sense that, he was not a thief. but he was a receiver of stolen goods. So if you got robbed, then the thief had to go to Jonathan Wilde and sell the stolen goods at a very small rate. Jonathan Wilde would then return your goods at a very high premium. So you got stolen out of 100 rupees worth of goods. The criminal got, say, 30 rupees, and Jonathan Wilde sold it back to at 70 rupees. And Jonathan Wilde became this kind of an intermediary who would be a receiver of stolen goods. And he became the kind of a prototype of the modern politician who takes a cut in everything. And Jonathan Wilde became, associated with the corrupt administration, or Jonathan Wilde became a kind of symbol of the corrupt administration led by Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister. Therefore, we see that Jonathan Wilde becomes the theme of many a criminal narrative. And the most notorious of them is Fielding's Jonathan Wilde. Now, in doing so, Fielding was using an older variety of a Spanish kind of narrative called the picaresque narrative. The picaroon or the picaro was a rogue. So the picaresque was a rogue's narrative, as it were, the rogue which existed out of the fringes of society. Then we can say that, very importantly, the picaresque and the criminal narrative also became part and parcel of the 18th century narrative scenario. And these were consumed by the lower classes of people with great pleasure. Now, very often, these criminals became part and parcel of the themes of the novels. You have Smollett using it, you have Fielding using it partially, right? You have Defoe using it. Therefore, criminality was an important, criminal narratives were an important constituent in the prose narrative. You also had the prose of desire and sexuality. Now, this I will categorize into different strands. You had, for example, the amatory novel written by women about female desire. Example being Heywood's Phantomina. So these were talking about aristocratic women who freely circulated sexuality, experienced it, wrote about them, and they became semi-pornographic tracts, which were written by women, consumed by women, and therefore they gathered great hostility. It was against one such, in these amatory fictions, that Richardson was writing a novel of virtue, right? So the erotic novel, as it were, written by women, was part and parcel of this literature of desire, prose of desire. And this was a prose that was semi-pornographic in nature, very suggestive. There was direct pornography, for example. And I will refer to one of the texts published by John Cleland, Fanny Hill, or Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, 1749. The date of publication coincided with the date of publication of Fielding's major novel, Tom Jones, where Cleland describes almost in graphic detail pornographic experiences, including sodomy, part of which had to be excised from the book till the early 20th century. So pornographic literature was in great vogue during the period. Also very important at this point of time was the biography of prostitutes, how women fell through poverty in many circumstances into the life of a whore. And remember, very often, you could be a maid one day and a prostitute the next. So There was rampant prostitution on the streets of London. So the prostitute and the criminal together became subjects of prose, and they were not reviled exactly. They became, subjects of sympathy, very often heroism, and their lives were consumed by the underclasses and the lower middle classes, who saw within them, within these narratives, part and parcel of their existential crisis, as it were. And of course, there was another form of literature that talked about literature itself, prose that talked about literature, literary criticism. You have Dryden, for example, writing his Origin and the Progress of Satire. You have Pope writing different tracts. You have Dr. Johnson writing different critical texts. So literary criticism also blossomed during the 18th century and was a different kind of a niche in prose writings. Now, all these forms found their ways into the one form that was rising, or the one form that came up during this period, and that was the 18th century novel. Now, you see, earlier you had romances, fictional narratives which were romances. But the 18th century novel, as it were, brought into itself a combination of the news and the fictional. For example, Defoe, when he's writing Moll Flanders, is taking the life history of Moll King, calling it a true history, and then adding fiction to it. Alexander Selkirk's Stay on the Island, adding fiction to it and becoming Robinson Crusoe. The novel was bringing within itself a kind of conduct book literature. How does a woman stop herself from the advances of the master, Pamela? And he was also bringing in the element of sexuality of the novel in Joseph Andrews or Shamela. There was also, of course, one other form which I should have mentioned is prose satire. The most important example of which would be Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. So prose satire was also an important constituent of the 18th century prose. So all of these went into the making of the novel. The novel was bringing in, on the one hand, the literature of morality, Richardson, the literature of sexuality, Fielding, the literature of news, Defoe, the literature of satire and parody in Sterne. So the novel was the form that brought in the literature of the news, the biographical, autobiographical, and the religious, the literature of criminality, and the literature of sexuality, desire, and satire within one broad amorphous category. And within its prefatory chapters, tried to define itself. So in Fielding's Tom Jones, we see a story and a criticism of the story, in the sense that the novel was trying to define itself. For example, the novelist was talking about his genre as a new province of writing, as Fielding suggested. It was a comic epic poem in prose, as Fielding suggested. It was like, the novelist was like an innkeeper who had to satisfy the desire of everybody, of morality, of sexuality, of criminality. So again, on a point that he was making, the novelist had to follow the rules of probability and possibility and not fall into the trap of the romance and the improbable. So what I'm trying to suggest is that during the 18th century, we saw different and what we'll call a fascinating range of prose forms that can be subdivided into different categories. The literature of news, the literature of desire, the literature, or rather the prose of religion, autobiography, biography, diaries, criminal biographies, horror biographies, literary criticism, satire. All of this created a panorama from which the novel borrowed. And the novel became, you see, the defining category of fictional prose, which also borrowed from the news. And therefore, these two terms, news and novels, continuously interacted with each other, something which I'll talk about probably when I discuss the rise of the novel and Robinson Crusoe. So finally, to get to my last point really in this rather longish lecture is, what were the implications behind the rise of such a fabulous amount of prose and a fascinating range of prose? We can see that this is the era from which, you see, prose becomes the dominant form of literature. And once the novel appears, it kind of sweeps everything in its path. The poetry takes a turn in the 18th century, 19th century in Romanticism and Victorianism. But remember, once the novel has arrived, it has swept away almost all other genres in its path. One. Secondly, literature turns public, oriented towards the public, talks about elements of the public sphere. And thirdly, a sudden explosion of the discussions about women, sexuality, enter into the prose of this century, which will lead to many of these debates about women, sexuality, so on and so forth, which will be sort of progressively discussed during the Victorian and the modern era. Also, very importantly, one of the other things that happens is that there is a rising self-consciousness about writing prose. How is the novel going to be written? What is its nature like? What are the experiments going to be with the novel? These are issues that will later on belong to the questions asked in modernism and postmodernism, especially in the novel. How does one construct a narrative? Who does one construct a narrative about? How does one organize a narrative? But I think the most important factor to figure out in this particular rise of prose in the 18th century is how democratic this movement was. That prose now became the staple consumption for all classes of people, and very importantly, it was cheaply available. And the rise of prose contributed to the rise of the discourse of news and the public sphere that emerged throughout the 18th century. So with the rise of modern democracy, with the gradual passing away of censorship, with the rise of a modern sensibility about society and the improvement of all classes, the availability of prose became an important feature of the age. The other thing which we need to also look at is that the nature and the quality of the prose was changing. From being biblical and complex, prose was now becoming simpler. Addison would use the term middle style, something which could be accessed, enjoyed by the people at large. So the quality of prose was becoming simpler, moderated. This also we'll look at when we discuss Addison. And finally, I would say that prose was also contributing in a very large sense, not only to information, but also to pleasure, and therefore a prose of desire, a prose of temporality, a prose of news, a much more direct, simple, accessible prose that could be understood and consumed by the lower and the lower middle classes came into being, replacing the high romances or religious allegories of earlier times. It is within this kind of a structure, philosophy, and form that we need to look at the various prose texts of the 18th century. It is with this comment that I'd like to bring today's lecture to an end, and I'll stop the recording, following which you can ask your questions.